Welcome to the Golden Doors Friday Night Speaker Series. As you can see, I'm so personally thrilled, being a huge fan of Mona's, to have Mona Simpson here with us. And we're going to talk about reading and books and stuff like that, and then we're going to open it up for you. So, Mona, in this world where we are with our kids, we were talking at dinner about this. Kids text, they don't spell. How do you, in this culture, continue to make reading and books relevant and important the way they are to you?
I don't worry about that. I don't think that's my job. I feel like, if they cease to be relevant, they'll cease to be relevant. I'm not worried about that because I don't think really they will. I mean, the only way to make books relevant is to make them good, really, to make them something that people want and need. I mean, I think sometimes, I think that's the challenge as fiction writers, is we have to make things, we have to go to the places in fiction that you can't go anywhere else. I mean, look at dramatic TV. I mean, how many of you are watching a series right now? I bet who's not? Is there anyone not watching one series? Okay, 2 people, that's pretty good. 3 people. What are you doing? That's interesting. Are you reading? Are you reading? Is that why you're not? What are you doing in lieu of?
I work.
That's interesting. Because so many people now do watch these series, and they're great. Some of them are. I thought The Wire was, art. It was a fantastic piece. So, I mean, I think it's the job of fiction to kind of go to the places that nowhere else can go, really, and give people what we want from it. And I think what you get from a great book is, I think it's a different experience than some of these other things, because reading it's not a passive thing, as those of you who read know. It's the reader brings a lot to the book, and you have to. I suppose it's akin to being here or something. When you go on that 8-mile hike at 4:30 or 5 in the morning. The mountain is beautiful, the scenery is beautiful, but you're also going up that mountain. There's quite a bit that you're bringing to the experience, and I think when we're talking about tinkering with your internal workings, it matters how much you invest.
Well, so what are the qualities in your experience that have to be there for a lifelong reader? Or if somebody said, Mona, why should I spend my time reading, particularly younger people now? How do you get them excited about it?
That's such a funny question. I don't think. I mean, I don't come across, I don't know. Maybe I should be doing more of that. It probably would be a good public service. But I sort of feel like, people find their way to what they need, I think. And I think it's funny, I was just last week at, there's a man I admire who's a sort of an educational guru in Los Angeles called Paul Cummins. He started a number of schools. And I have an educator in the next book I'm writing, so I went with him. He's in his 80s now, and so he's doing a lot of things that he didn't do when he was in the middle of his working life. And one thing he does is he teaches at a juvenile detention center. Basically, if you're a young juvenile criminal in Los Angeles, you're not sent exactly to prison. You're sent in sort of to a prison that's actually a camp. They were built in the 50s as these sort of camps in the mountains for young criminals. And he goes there and he teaches a class. And I went, and it was kind of a beautiful thing. He had this class full of, these were only boys at this particular, this was called Camp Gonzalo. And it was a place that was built, the good news is crime is down in Los Angeles, and whereas these places are all built for like 130 people to live there, and there were 38. But the kind of amazing thing was several of these kids, or I think a certain proportion of these kids really have a moving and important experience at this camp, because it's the first time they've gotten any sort of decent education. And this man was teaching a poetry class, and most of these kids, they were gang kids. I guess now hopefully ex-gang kids. They were tattooed, all over their arms, but also in their heads would sometimes. One of them had Cudahy, Cudahy, tattooed on the side of his crew-cutted head. And I said, "What's Cudahy?" I didn't know what it was. He said, "That's my neighborhood. That's where I live. It's next to Linwood, apparently." Anyway, he brought in Pablo Neruda poems for these boys, and he had them translate them, and then he read them the translations, and they were beautiful. They did beautiful, moving translations, and this was the first time they've had, a class that sort of spoke to their souls, and that they were given a chance to do well at. And what they brought to the they had enough. They weren't behind. They weren't in the way he structured the class. They could do well, and it was kind of a very moving thing. So I think, I'm sure when Pablo Neruda was writing these poems, he wasn't thinking that years after his death, some young gangbangers in Los Angeles who are in their 6 months of detention would be translating him and find themselves changed by it. But I think that's the kind of thing that you strive for, that you try and make something good enough, and hopefully people will come to it. I have 2 children. They're completely different in terms of reading. One has just been a reader all his life and is that kind of kid. And the other one is dyslexic and has some ADD, and she seemed sort of like and even now, if you asked her, she would say, her English is her worst subject, she would say, even though she does well in it, as she would say, math is much easier for her. But she's always loved poetry, so, people find different things that they need, I think.
As this educator, Paul Cummins, is an extraordinary man, and you can look him up online and see the kind of work he's done. He's done some really incredible work in LA. How do you describe your job as a writer and an author? And if you had to fill out a job description, what is the author's job?
You mean sort of in case anyone is thinking of making a career switch?
Yeah. I think, probably everybody would like to do it, but
I don't know. I don't think many people would like to do it at all. In fact, I don't even know if I would like to do it. It's just what I'm sort of meant to do, I think. But you spend a lot of time alone, just on a practical level. Writing anything worthwhile it really takes your whole life. It's what you do. You're not kind of writing and having a full gay participatory life. You're kind of not. This is what you do, and you're kind of always doing it. So it's what I do most of the time, always. It's very consuming. It takes hours and hours. I write many, many drafts of things. I usually number my drafts, and some sections I'll write and they won't change much between the first time I've written it and the finished book. But other sections I'll have rewritten 285 times. So it's and I get something out personally. I would do it even if I think I would do it even if I didn't. If it weren't my profession, I would still do it. So I get something personally from it. But you have to need that. You have to like time alone. You have to need that.
And okay, so that was my next question. What is it that animates you? In other words, if you're in there, whether it's the first draft or the 285th draft, is it the refining, if you can describe this, of an idea or a combination of words, or?
You kind of write books, but you kind of don't. There's a way in which you start a book and you write passages for it, and you go over it, and then you research some things, and then you write other passages. And at a certain point, it begins to form itself. These patterns emerge that you haven't planned, that are just there. So at a certain point, you're kind of in a collaboration with this thing. Some people would say it's your unconscious. I'm sure it is. But you definitely want to finish it. It's like a very intense puzzle or something that you want to get right. Because it also happens to address, even though it's not necessarily the story of your life or anything, usually it isn't, especially even if you wrote the story of your life once by, the time you've written a few books. It's not the overt story of your life, but it has being a writer also has the advantage, and I suppose you could say the disadvantage of also, it's concerned with your deepest concerns. So let's say something terrible happened to someone. Let's say, I don't know, what's the worst thing you can imagine? Maybe their child was killed or something. I mean, their book probably won't be about a child who was killed, but that loss and sorrow and what to do with it will be all, that on some level is what that writer is going to be working with in their project. And they want to find some structure which will make something beautiful out of that. That's what it feels like. It feels like you're working until you come to some position, some form, some shape.
In your books and many people's books, people assume it is your life, but it's really not your life. So how do you sort of, like you grew up in Wisconsin and many of your books are in Wisconsin, stuff like that. So does it
2
inform?
out of 6.
Right. Does it inform you because it's familiar, but then people assume, well, that's a true story. How do you sort of deal with that?
It's in a way, it's a very complex problem. There's a woman, I'll start by saying, I don't know, those of you who are readers, I have a recommendation for you. There's a great writer who's just been translated into English in the last 5 years or something, named Elena Ferrante. And of her work, she's written this brilliant book of it's a tetralogy. It was supposed to be a trilogy, but she couldn't finish it up in 3. And her work feels, and apparently is, very, very autobiographical. And she did kind of a brilliant thing at the beginning of her career, which is she adopted a pseudonym and published under a pseudonym and refused to ever appear in print or, nothing like this ever. She just would not do any publicity, so nobody knows who exactly she is or where she lives. She lives in Italy, but I mean, that is about as much as anyone knows. No one knows her personal circumstances. Nobody knows anything about her. And so she's sort of gotten around that thing, which is kind of, the readers do, I mean, we all do it, writers do it, even writers who themselves change things and make things up and exaggerate things and diminish things. And even though we do it ourselves all the time, when we read someone else's book, we think, oh, I wonder if he had that affair with but I think there's a way in which it's only a problem kind of superficially, you know what I mean? It's not a deep problem. I don't really care if somebody thinks my book is true or not. I mean, you want them to think it's true enough that they believe it. So whether they think that I, the author, had that experience, I don't deeply care. I do care about the people I care about, so I don't want, I wrote a book about a mother and a daughter, which was definitely not, a book about my mother. And of course, she knew because she lived her life. So she knew what was made up and what wasn't, and she'd read it before it was published and everything. But what I didn't anticipate it was like maybe her dry cleaner would think it was her, you know what I mean? And so that worried me. That concerns one a little, but that's a problem.
But it's a double-edged sword because somebody like Elena Ferrante may not want to be known, but many writers do want to be known. So the other side of it is,
I don't think most writers really. Maybe I don't know if I think writers want their work to be known. I don't know if writers want their life to be known. We have kind of dull lives, really.
Doesn't look very dull over here. But how do characters in reading your books? I wonder, how are these people so beautifully fleshed out, the intricacy of their lives? Do they arrive fully formed in your consciousness, or do they show up in a dream? In other words, I mean, in my Hollywood or in Casebook, I sat there sobbing and realized these aren't real people, and I'm crying over yet another set of characters in here.
Characters in books are definitely not real people. It's interesting. I mean, in a way, you know a lot more about your characters than you do even about, some of your best friends or your closest people, because you know their secrets, you know the things they don't tell people. I think they kind of build, they kind of accrue, and it's, characters are both, they're kind of bigger and they're smaller than real people. They're pronounced in a few characteristics. I don't know, you pick up things from life and then they merge with other things.
Do they show up with names for you personally?
No, usually not names. I usually have a vision of a person or their character, the way they behave.
And what about a story, like in Casebook? I don't know, how many of you have read Casebook? I don't want to put you on the spot. Okay, I've read Casebook. Okay, but so do the story just show up?
Not
In other words,
usually.
where's
usually
the
a little? Usually there's a some of it, but not all of it.
Right, so,
A lot of it comes in the years of writing it,
and in that process.
which is what keeps it interesting. I mean, if I knew it all and I was just kind of recording what I already knew, I think I'd be bored.
But based on the 6 books, what kind of, when you recognize the germ of an idea, do you then go, oh yes, that one's the keeper? I'm just interested in you describing your process, if you can.
Well, I think there are different kinds of writers in that regard. I'm somebody who usually has a lot of ideas, and so I'll write them all. I keep many notebooks and stuff. But then usually one will just kind of, like a snowball, like an avalanche or something, one will grow more. You know, if you planted a bunch of seeds, a couple will grow more than others, and you kind of go with that. And it's not even necessarily the idea, maybe I would want to write a great American war novel or something, but I'm not sure really I could. To some extent you're limited by what you're able to do. There's a way in which, and that's not to say what you know, I don't believe this sort of write what you know business either. I think you can write plenty of things you don't literally know, but you can't necessarily write something that you're not moved to write in some way. Or you have some access, and you can become aware of that, I think.
I'm sure, how many people in this room want to write a book? Right, so people want to write books.
Not so many, 2, right?
3, well, I've written short stories, something. People have ongoing fantasies about writing a book at different points in their life. What would you tell people about what does it actually take to sit down and do that first book, or any first book?
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends what you want out of that book too, but I would just say, start it, try it, do a little bit every day and see where it takes you. I mean, if you really want to spend your life doing this, it'll take over everything. You'll be reading all the time. You'll be staying home. You'll be, it'll dominate your life. But people can write. Some people have written books. Some people have written a book, before they've gone to work in the morning, 1 hour a day, and they've had something they wanted to say, and they capture it, and it has been done.
Throughout your books, I find that many of your characters have unexpected twists and turns. Really unexpected. You're reading the book and you think it's going one way, and then boom, it goes a completely different way. When you start to write, is that an intention, or do you have a storyline, or does the character sometimes come in and surprise you as well?
Sometimes definitely the character will surprise you. Usually usually for me it's in the form of, you feel like you're sort of writing all over the place, and all of a sudden this person over here is an agent for this, and the patterns form and it kind of comes together on its own. So that does happen. And that's very satisfying. It usually doesn't happen for a long time though. It's like you write on a book for, maybe it's probably like starting a business. We were talking to these two who have this great fashion company. But you work on something, you work on something, you work on something, and then after a while it begins to kind of almost see itself as an entity.
Do you go back and read your own books?
No, not once they're done, because I read them so many hundreds of times before they're published. I think I would start marking it up. wanting to change things. It would be too
And
much trouble.
When you do the final read, are you surprised that there's a book there?
You mean when I read the final galleys or something?
Yeah.
Oh, it's just very stressful, actually. I mean, usually by that point, you're taking out the comma that you put in the last draft, and it's a kind of obsessive's nightmare. So
if you do research, so for example, I'm going to use Casebook again because that's your most recent book. It's the story of it's a complicated story, but for the purpose of this conversation, about a child who's a little suspicious about his mother's new boyfriend, and he becomes a detective and uncovers a fraud. And this was just incredible because the book was going one way, and then I was just flabbergasted and so deeply moved. And thought, you know, how does this sort of unfold? You know, where does this come from? If you can just talk about that process for you, or you're going along and you think it's in one direction, and then suddenly this whole different thing unfolds that is completely unexpected. And there's a depth there, and you're switched into a child's point of view. And you know, does this just move you kind of up and down and take you to different places?
yeah, I mean, I think as a writer, you're considering all of the characters in a funny way. Like all of the characters you have in a book, even the little minor ones, you tend to know them very well, and you know their whole story. But they might only appear just a little bit in the book because the whole story is not necessary for the book. They're just in there for one reason. But you know all this about them, so what sort of the challenge is you want to kind of get the right resonant details so that a reverberation of much more than their little bit part will sort of linger through the book. Because you do know so much more about them. It's sort of like, what it's like in a way is, I mean, being a writer is very much like, I don't want to put this the wrong way, but it's a bit like being a gossip in the best sense of the word. I mean, it's like being a person who's really interested in people and in their lives and their loves and their fortunes and misfortunes and behavior and misbehavior. So it's as if you know, the way you know your whole family. Let's say you're telling somebody the story of one little anecdote of your family, even though maybe your sister or your father is only a minor character in that little incident. You know him so well that the way he is also is part of what gives the story its feeling and its mood and its shape. So it's finding those little details that convey the whole thing that you can't fit in just a little bit, in a minor appearance.
Did you always have what you knew to be strong powers of observation watching people? Because I think for me, your characters are so finely drawn, and they're so complex, and they're so real.
Well, thank you. Well, you know, I think everybody has sort of certain things let's put it this way, I've always been a mediocre to bad driver. My family says I'm not a great driver. And I think it's because I do notice things too much in a way. You know, focus can be a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. When did you know that about yourself?
That I was a bad driver?
No.
I could narrate the story of my insurance company could narrate the story of my accidents, most of which do not involve other cars.
Well, that's good. And people.
Or people, no. They usually involve like stationary objects.
As long as you're not.
But when I knew I'd be a writer, I wanted to be a writer in high school, I think, even then. But then I went to college and considered other things and ended up deciding to
What
do
did you consider?
You know, I wanted to be it's a sort of a bizarre story. I wanted to be a writer. I went to college, but I'd been raised by a single mother who was now I understand, now that I'm a parent myself, but, you know, she just had one kid, and we were together all the time, and all of a sudden I was leaving to go to college. And back in the days when I went to college, as some of you know, you really left. You know, long distance cost extra money. It wasn't, we didn't have cell phones, you didn't text. Now I hear from my college son almost more than I would need to. You know, each of his papers is sent for editing. But, and he expects an answer within the hour. But it wasn't like that when I went, so my mother was very, very upset. So I lived in Los Angeles, with a single mother, and my mother was talking about, I mean, she would say this sort of anecdotally, she really was very depressed when I was going to college, and she talked about it as if it was unrelated, but she said, well, when I drive you up to college, I was going to Berkeley, maybe you won't see me anymore, maybe I'll just drive over the cliffs on my way home. And I was really disturbed by this, and obviously, and I was, you know, this teenager in high school, but I worked already, I had a job, and so I went in the phone book and I found the name of a psychiatrist in Century City. I lived in Los Angeles, so I rode my bike to the psychiatrist. I called, I said, may I have an appointment? And he gave me an appointment, and I brought a bunch of cash, because I worked at Swenson's ice cream shop, and I had all this tip money. And I went and I said, you know, my mother is threatening to kill herself if I go to college. And he listened to me talk about it for 40 minutes, and he said, I think she's exaggerating. It's going to be fine, just go. Which now when I think of it, how did he know? I mean, she could have been, you know, as the kids say now, batshit crazy, and she could have killed herself, and it would have been horrible for my life. As it happened, he was right. I went to Berkeley, she was fine, life went on. But I thought then that I wanted to be a doctor, so I did pre-med, and I did that for about a year. And I think the happiest day of my mother's life was when in those days they sent you little cards with your grades. It wasn't on the internet, there was no internet yet. And I got an A in chemistry, and it was like the happiest day of my mother's life. But anyway, I was home for Christmas vacation, and I went back to the psychiatrist, who, by the way, hadn't accepted my money. He was a very honorable guy, a very kind guy, more than honorable. And I said, well, I'm taking pre-med, but I sort of want to be a doctor, I sort of want to be a writer. And he talked to me again for 40 minutes, the 40-minute session. And by the end of it, he said, well, you really love this writing. I think you want to be a doctor to sort of, you know, save your mother. Go be a writer. So there it was.
Have you been in touch with him since then?
You know, I did a talk with the LA Chamber Orchestra last year, I think. And he came to this reading. He had always sort of looked like Kafka. But there
Which
he
isn't
was.
necessarily a good look.
Oh, I thought it was a very good look. But there he was. Yes, so I did see him again.
But I want to point out how responsible you were that you went to the psychiatrist to make sure your mother would be okay. Some people wouldn't have considered that.
I think maybe most people would, don't you think?
No.
I don't know.
No.
I wasn't so responsible. I'm not even so responsible now.
Oh, no. I think that was very, very responsible. But, God, that is great. And I asked you when we were sitting down when you really started to write, and you said in your 20s.
Well, I mean, I was writing in high school, but I really got very, very serious in my 20s.
And
or college, I guess.
Do you remember, was it in college? In other words, when you sat down to write the book that would be your first book published, did you say, this is it, I'm a writer now, I'm doing this, and I'm going to publish this book?
You know, it's funny that you say that, because I remember when I was in my 20s, it was a big deal for myself and my friends as to what we would say when people asked us what we did. Like, because it's a big thing to say you were a writer, because the next question is, are you published? Right. And of course, at that point, the answer was no. So it's kind of it's an aspirational thing to say, suffice it to say. But, so what I did in those years is I remember I had a boyfriend, and we went to some event, and a guy from Rolling Stone magazine asked me, he was there with this sort of beautiful blonde with pearls, and he said, and what do you do? And I said, just what I would say when people ask, I'd just say, nothing. I do nothing, because I just wanted to sort of avoid the whole inquisition, because I knew I didn't have anything impressive to say, so I just thought, nothing. And he said, well, you could say you're in graduate school at Columbia and you're writing a novel, and but there's something that's sort of unappealing about that whole trying to prove oneself.
How has that been for you to be?
Oh, that's been fine. Richard was working for The Simpsons, and it was his first job in comedy. He's now had many shows, but he started at that show, and his first show he wanted to write, I sort of decided with him he would write about, it's hard when you think of it, if you start writing for a show that's been on for a while, you're limited by what they've done before. It's very different than starting a novel where you can make up anything. So he was sort of looking around for a character and he noticed that Homer Simpson, the dad, his mother had never been referred to or introduced. So he decided that I just, at that point, had just written a novel called The Lost Father, which was about a search for a lost father. So he decided Homer would have a search for his lost mother. So we decided to name it Mona Simpson. And the funny thing was, he was just starting in comedy, I was a writer, and our child was in a nursery school in New York, and they called us in to ask for money, and they asked for a phenomenal amount of money. I mean, an amount of money that, we would have never had. And we said, no, of course not. We don't have a fraction of that amount of money, not only to give, but just to have it all. And why did you think we would have, hundreds of millions of dollars? And they said, oh, well, we thought you created The Simpsons because, your name, Mona's name is Simpson, and you write for The Simpsons. And so it turned out to be a funny thing.
That's incredible. That's funny. And do people mix it up in real life, too?
Happily, no. I don't have tall purple hair.
Do you think it makes a difference if people read Danielle Steele or you as long as they're reading? No comparison intended there, just as long as they're reading.
I haven't read Danielle Steele, so I don't know. I don't think that, though, that people, I don't think you get the same things from, I haven't read Danielle Steele, so I have no commentary about Danielle Steele, but I do think the quality of what you read matters, just like the quality of what you eat matters, or the quality of what you watch matters. I think, for sure.
Do you have a guilty pleasure that you read in the Inquirer at the, supermarket checkout? That'd be a good.
If I did, I wouldn't feel guilty about it. You know what I mean? I read. What do I read? I think I read some down market things, but I'm trying to think. Whenever I get my hands on it, I don't subscribe, but I read Vanity Fair. That's not so much different, probably from.
It's different. Let's talk a little bit about the short stories that you brought. One is your own.
Yes,
Steps.
I brought one of mine, which is a recent one I published. It's the most recent one I published just this spring. So I brought that, and then I brought this story by Alice Munro, who I just love and think is, well, I would like to say she's the best living writer, and she is, I think, one of the best living writers. She's not writing anymore. She's 84, and she suffers from, sadly, she suffers from dementia, so she's stopped writing, and she's decided that she's going to spend the rest of her life sort of doing the things she didn't do all these years because she was writing. So she says she's having lunch with people, and she's really loving it.
Let me ask you why you think she is the best living writer, though. What is it that you see?
Well, I just think, I don't know, that's a silly thing to say in a way that anyone's the best anything.
No, but in any case, why
there
you,
are so many
right.
great, I love this Elena Ferrante,
But
too.
why did you choose that story then for us?
Well, I was looking, she's certainly the best short story writer, and she's also, she's written her whole career, a lot about the lives of women with, there's men in the stories too, and they're great too, but think of all the, most of you who are readers have grown up reading books by men and then books by women. So there aren't that many, we don't have the tradition. There aren't as many books written by women. There aren't as many stories about sex written by women. There aren't as many stories written about ambition, And she's sort of done all of that and beautifully. And she's really she's made the form her own. She writes these short pieces, but they contain almost as much as novels. They contain whole lives.
So talk a little about Wenlock Edge then. That's the short story you have.
Well, I feel like I feel like I should just let you discover it by yourself, really. But I mean, when I give it, when I teach at UCLA 1 night a week, I'm in the English department there, and I sometimes assign this story, and the prompt I give them then I say, you know, have you ever had a roommate who's gotten you into trouble? It's about a very odd circumstance that a young woman gets in the middle of because her roommate whom she has. But one interesting thing about it is she's a scholar. The narrator, I think, is a scholarship girl, and so she's living as a roomer in a house owned by a woman with children, you know, a woman who has a young family. And that woman is a very, very minor character in the story. It's mostly about two very different men and their relationships with these college girls. But the landlord is a very, very minor character, but notice the landlord. There's all kinds of, each minor character, there are all kinds of very strange things with. They have a very odd dinner. There's a very odd dinner she's invited to.
And your own piece, Steps.
Oh, I just gave it to you because it's the most recent story I've written and published. I don't know what to say about it.
Great. Thank you, Mona Simpson.